I am Darrin Steele, two-time Olympian in the sport of bobsled, competed in 98 and 2002. Up until September of last year, I was the CEO of USA Bobsled Skeleton, and I am currently the Vice President of Sport for the International Federation. So I just completed a few weeks ago my PhD in leadership, research, and policy. I've also got an MBA from UC Berkeley and studied economics at Eastern Illinois University, where I competed in track and field. So I got my bachelor's and master's in econ. So overeducated and sports junkie. So, but competed in bobsled after track and field, which is a fairly common route.
And I've noticed that. Why is that?
Well, bobsled is interesting from a standpoint of developing athletes, because certainly pilots, that's more of a traditional route. Skeleton and being a bobsled driver takes a lot longer to develop those skills. But for a push athlete, we used to say that an athlete comes to us with 90% of the skills already. And that's because we look for athletes that have already developed their skills in power and speed, which is important for the start. The athletes are the engine. And so it's all about being explosive and being fast with that top end speed. And so track and field is a natural place to look. So is football, and really any fast sprinter from a variety of sports is the target demographic for bobsled, and skeleton to a lesser extent, just because you've got the driving component in skeleton.
But as a push athlete, you don't just, okay, I'm involved for the first 3 seconds of the event, and then I just sit there. There are more things that you have to do. Right.
Especially for, in the four-man, loading into the sled from the side when you're going full speed, there's a serious technical component, and it's got to be automatic. You can't be thinking about it too much, or it's going to take too long to execute the move. And if it doesn't go right, then you might not wind up in the sled, and that's a problem.
That's not a good thing, right?
No, but then once you're in, you also have to be very much aware of where you are. For the brakeman, that individual has to pull the brakes and stop the sled at the end. And if you do it too early, you're going to slow yourself down, which you don't want. And if you do it too late, you just might fly off the end of the track, which happens on occasion. It's rare. It happened to me during my career, and I don't recommend it. It's not very fun. But you also have to be aware of the curves that are coming up, because you don't want movement inside the sled. So if you're watching a race and you see the helmets of one of the athletes or several moving too much from side to side, that you're losing time in the race. And so the athletes should be kind of bracing for a hard curve if it's coming up, so that they don't move around too much. And so, flexing one half your body, the left or right, depending on where you are, is important. And every once in a while, if you're, out of position up on two runners, maybe, then the athletes can help to bring it back down, and where you're on the edge of maybe crashing or not. It is possible for the athletes to help it back down on four runners. And you see that every so often. It's rare, but that's when you really want the team to know exactly where they are in the track.
Okay, now you said you transitioned from track and field. What was your discipline in track and field?
I competed in the decathlon.
So you're prepared for all kinds of different things at that point.
I was, yeah, but I enjoyed the the sprints and the explosive events, and so that's why I was recruited, because my 100 meters was pretty good, and I was a larger athlete, and so decathletes they're kind of natural fits if they've got speed, because they're going to have more size to them, and for bobsled, you want bigger athletes because, the weight is important, and you don't have to, bulk up too much if you're a decathlete. Whereas if you're a sprinter, you're probably going to have to put some weight on to be competitive.
Now, see, that's something I hadn't thought about. Do you want to be heavier so you're down further on the ice or further on the surface?
Well, it's there's a maximum weight allowed, and so they weigh the sled and the athletes and the helmets and the shoes and all that at the bottom of the track, and there's a maximum that you can be. And so the larger the athletes are, the lighter the sled gets to be. And so if you're pushing a lighter sled, you're going to have a faster start. And so that's why you want the sled to be, at the minimum weight if possible, so that the weight is in the athletes and the push should be faster. Within the athletes, you also want to make sure that the center of gravity is as low as possible. So you don't want the weight in an athlete to just be in the shoulders and the chest, because that's a higher center of gravity, and then that side-to-side motion has an even bigger impact. So, we caution athletes not to spend too much time on, curls and bench press, because that's wasted size, really. It should be in the, primarily in the legs if you're adding weight to the athlete.
Okay, now that's something I wouldn't have thought of, because as I get into this, things that are explained to me make perfectly good sense after I hear them.
Right,
but it's something I never would have thought of. I was talking to one of the luge sliders a couple of days ago, and he mentioned that you don't see where you're going in a luge.
Right.
Well, huh? And after I thought about it, I went, well, yeah, you can't. But I didn't think about how do you careen down the track at 90 miles an hour and you can't see where you're going? That doesn't seem possible. But then when I pictured in my head, it's like, no, that's the way it is. So I wouldn't have thought about weight distribution and how much you think about that, but it does make sense now that you mention it.
Right. Yeah, it's one of those things that's, just part of the sport, and you know it when you're in it, but from the outside, it's not something that's going to jump out at you probably.
Now, how do you make the transition? How do you say, you know what, I'm no longer involved in track, or my career has ended, but I'm still competitive? Do you go seek them out? Do they seek you out, or do you get a tryout? How does that work out?
You see it both ways. And certainly there's a recruiting process that takes place. And so, some athletes are targeted, some identify themselves as, this is a possible route for me, because like you said, many athletes get to the end of their career in a sport that they're in. And that's tough because, sports, it's cruel in a lot of ways, because it's only available to younger people. And so when you leave the sport, it's when your knowledge of the sport is at the highest. And so you think about all the investment in learning and training that you've got. And if you don't go into coaching, then it feels like it's kind of a waste. You've got all this knowledge that's not going to be good for anything if you're not coaching when you leave, and that's just the cruel reality of it. There's obviously a lot that you take away that you probably don't think about at the time, but if you still feel like you are competitive and you're not done yet, but realize you've hit the limit in the sport that you're in, then bobsled as a push athlete, that's one of the few sports you can jump into. And it's frankly one of the sales pitches that's effective, is to go to a great athlete and say, look, you're at the end of your career here in this sport, and you probably didn't know it, but you've also been training for bobsled. And it's not unheard of to become an Olympic medalist in 2 years, or 1 year if you're Lauren Williams. And so it can happen. And that can be a pretty compelling argument for an athlete that's not looking to spend another 10 years in in a sport. But year and a half, 2 years, that is realistic for many. And so, you're not going to develop a pilot for one of those athletes, but,
Right. Excuse me.
you got to have a great start. And so if you can have some, amazing athletes that are only involved in a short time, there's very often that can work with the strategy that you've got.
Well, you mentioned a couple things, and if I'm not mistaken, the former sprinter Willie Davenport is the first person that comes to my mind. That
Right.
you look on the screen like, didn't I just see him over? Wait a second, yeah. So that was the first thing. I went, wow, that's pretty interesting. But now it makes sense. And something that you mentioned from my perspective, when I first entered college, I entered into education, and my dad said, "Well, you want to be a coach?" I'm like, "No, I'm still a player. I don't want to be a coach." And then 20 years later, I became a coach. I'm like, well, that's the natural. I still want to be involved. So, and being in administration and whatnot, it still keeps you involved in that. So, I understand where you're going from there. And I noticed something that you had written on something online of you were talking about the Tiger Woods effect and how we unfortunately burn out our kids because we place too much on them early. But if they fall in love with athletics or sports or whatever you want to call it, that they're more apt to be involved as a coach, as the next part, an administrator, something like that, and perpetuate that love and passion of sports in a business sense as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most common mistakes that I see, and I've seen it for a long time. I had a coworker who was asking advice. This was shortly after I competed in the '98 games, and was working in one of my first jobs. And his son was playing hockey, and he was concerned because his son had a lot of talent, but didn't seem to be working as hard as he needed to get to the next level. And he wanted my advice on how he could get him to, commit more. And I hadn't been involved with youth sports at the time, but it was something that was really, just kind of understood from an athlete standpoint. And my advice was, look, the only thing that you can do, and the only thing you need to do, is make sure he loves the sport and help him to love the sport. Because once that happens, you can probably get out of his way. You're not going to have to worry about him working hard because it doesn't feel like work, because he's going to love it. And that's the mistake that I see, is that because there is such an incentive waiting for you at the end if you do continue and do develop and become elite. And there's scholarships and professional sports and Olympics and all that. But the thing is, to focus on those, it's probably going to be a mistake. They're going to happen for select individuals that have a combination of natural talent. So there's genetics involved, plus work ethic, plus the right mindset. But I think the data is pretty clear that it's the athletes that love it that are going to stick with it, and when they stick with it, they're going to develop better. And being too focused on the scholarship or the professional route, it doesn't work for most athletes. And it kind of takes the fun away, and that's the beginning of the end.
Well, and there's so many stories that you can tell, but the cliche is, if you want to have an undefeated season, you have to win today's game. You can't worry about what happens down there if you don't take care of business here. If you want to win a gold medal, you have to qualify for the Olympics. Right. In order to qualify for the Olympics, you have to have those qualifying time and blah, 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 blah. So yeah, there's the focus on what you have to focus on. And then that will either get you there or it won't, but you can't get there without that. And
Right.
From my experience as a former administrator, there was a lot of that, and it worked well on both ends. I was approached as an athletic director for a U6 soccer team to get practice time. And my first thought was, did you say under 6? And they went, yeah, like, but what? And I was like, well, but no, they Okay, but then after I thought about it, if you're introducing them to the game, to the sport, or just to the discipline of athletics in and of itself, that's okay. If you're trying to prepare them to make the World Cup team, that's not good. But if you're saying, here's something fun for you to do, go out and enjoy yourself, have a snack, kick the ball, kick your little brother in the head, have a good time, and then see what happens goes from there, that's okay. Now, introducing them to that and having the parents understand that is a whole different thing. And I like what you wrote about that. It's like, get them involved, but then you can get out of the way if they love it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the tests is, are they playing the sport outside of practice?
Right.
Are they doing pickup games? Are they, grabbing their friends to do it? Because, that's the sign that it's because of the enjoyment, because no scouts are going to be around in the pickup game in the neighborhood. And we don't see nearly as much of that today as we used to. And hopefully we'll see that again, because, at the end of the day, some of the kids that get weeded out first are the ones that need to stay involved with physical activity the most. And when you're involved as a kid, you're much more likely to be involved as an adult. And we've got a problem with, obesity and diabetes in this country.
Right.
And we're cutting PE programs, in the schools. And that's where most people are first introduced to the sports that they continue on and compete in. And, if you look at, okay, what makes an adult to, somebody in the 30s or 40s or 50s participate in sports, and they're not looking for scholarships or contracts, right? It's because it's fun.
Right.
And we got to tap into that from kids, and remind ourselves that, look, this isn't an investment in their future. We have to get back to because of the things that it gives you as an individual, and how that just is carried with you throughout life. And it's a mistake to miss that.
Well, I think you mentioned something very important. Are you playing when you don't have to play? Are you involved when you don't have to play? Is it, okay, on Tuesday at 5:00, I go to basketball practice or baseball practice, whatever, and then I don't play again until Thursday at 4:00, and then I don't pick up the bat or the glove until the next Tuesday? Or are you out there throwing the ball up in the air and throwing it off the wall and fielding grounders off of the wall and trying to hit the tree and all the stuff that my father was getting sick of me doing, but that's what I did, right? Or you'd get 3 kids in the neighborhood and play a game of baseball with 3 kids, even though you needed more than that. You'd figure out a way to cut the field in half or whatever you do, because it's summer and you go out and play and you're working on your game, but you're not working on it. So, you're right. I think that because we are so organized now, and we have the ability to be able to be that organized with our kids and get people from point A to point B to work on things, but we don't actually let them get on their bike and ride to another neighborhood and play a game of pickup soccer just because, one kid over there's got a soccer ball. Let's go play. Right.
And I mean, something as simple as figuring out the bases, if you don't have any, there's value in that, and settling a dispute if you disagree on whether somebody out of bounds or broke the rule, and having to figure that out. Allowing the kids to do that, there's tremendous value in that. And you need those skills when you get out in life and you get on the job and you've got, group projects or teams. It's kind of training ground for life. And, but it requires us to take a step back and let the kids explore.
Figure it out for themselves,
figure it out and just, explore different options. And you're going to fail, and that's all right. Because you're going to figure out that you can make mistakes and learn from it. And I mean, all the important things that you learn from sports is, they're life lessons.
Though I'm picturing in my head being in a corporate meeting in a meeting room and trying to say, yeah, but my mom won't let us use the lawn chair for the strike zone anymore. So, but that is the idea. You come up with another solution, right? Yeah. And I think that, and I'm going to come off as an old fuddy-duddy, which I do on this all the time, but I think we've organized ourselves or our kids out of being able to go out and play. There's a comedian will come out and say, I would come home from school, if my homework was done, I wouldn't see anyone in my house until the streetlights came on. And that was it. You changed clothes, you went outside, you went and ran around. I had the good fortune to move back to my old home, my childhood home, to help my parents out a while ago. And in the house that I grew up in, there were kids all over the place when I was a kid, running all over the place. You couldn't walk outside and not hear somebody yelling, screaming, doing something. Right. 30 years later, I'm in that house. I don't even know if there were any children in the neighborhood. I never saw them. I never heard them. No one whizzed by on a bike. I didn't see them out raking leaves or cutting grass or anything like that. So, yeah, it is a different existence. Not that it's always a bad existence. It's just different. And as sports are concerned, I think that, like you're saying, you introduce them to the fun of it first and move on from there. Now, when you're looking at running the national organization and now part of the international organization, how do you draw on your experiences from your transition from a track athlete to a Olympic athlete to in that corporate environment and all the education, all that? How does that fit into, okay, the international association has to do what now to make sure that this is still a viable event?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the first thing that you've got for an international organization is a lot of different cultures that have to be able to come together, and that in itself can be a real challenge. And so you've got a lot of different points of view, and if you're making decisions on say a female discipline versus a male discipline, you might have some odd conversations that you don't typically see, in the U.S. or North America.
Right.
And you have to, accept that, okay, this is the reality. And so maybe we have to start way back here to bring people along, to do the right thing. But that's the reality of international organizations. And so, and a lot of times, change in a traditional sport can be incredibly challenging to convince people to, that it's time to make a change. But I think the most important thing, in those situations that I've discovered is that when you let people know what the risk is, and typically if you're making a change, people might not always see the value or the improvement that the change is going to create. But if they can be convinced that it's more dangerous to keep the status quo than to make change, like it is for, gender specific changes that you're trying to make to bring some, gender equity to the sport, like we've done in international bobsleigh, then they can start to get it a little bit. But if they don't see the benefit, then you better show them the risk, and that can be an effective way to bring them along.
Now, is there a lot of international recruiting involved as well as you were recruited?
Not as much. It's the way that happens is as we look at ways to grow the sport, because that is important. You're looking at introducing it to new nations. And so, internationally, how can you help a nation that hasn't been involved in the sport to take it on? And I think one of the challenges we see is it's much more common to see an athlete or a team of athletes that really are driving the introduction into a nation. And the challenge there is, okay, we might be able to lay the groundwork for that athlete or that team to compete in the games, but is it a sustainable model? And that is dependent on whether or not the nation is able to have a national federation that is, going to have an infrastructure and going to be able to do recruiting and development for the next athlete to come along. But if it's only a single athlete without, any real pipeline, it's a serious challenge. And so it's easier to help a nation that's got a history in the sport to grow it internally than it is to help a nation create an infrastructure that's going to be sustainable. And so that's one of the challenges that we've got internationally as we look at development.
And I know this isn't a sport that's got a track in every city. So when you're talking about it being, okay, we think that, let's just say Albania, just off the top of my head because it's an A, they have a few people that want to be involved, and they think that they have the ability to create a national federation, but they don't have a track.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an important part of looking at it and go, okay, we need to have some place for you to train here, or it's okay for you to go train over here in Germany?
Yeah, that is a huge challenge. And so, we encourage the larger, better funded nations to have partnerships and, in some ways to adopt a developing nation and support them, and maybe it's not financial, but helping them with, some coaching and, letting them train with your athletes, giving them a break on fees for sliding, all those things help because there's almost always a challenge financially for those teams because it's a very expensive sport. And so, but really, especially if you're not funded well, having partnerships with nations that do have tracks is it's crucial. And so, Germany has 4 tracks, US has 2, Canada has 2, only 1 is functional at the moment. And then, a lot of nations with a single track, well, a few nations with a single track, there's not a lot of tracks around. And so, but every nation, whether they've got, if they don't have a track, they typically have what they consider their home track. And so they're able over time to develop relationships, with those tracks and with those nations that have them. In some cases, a lot more formal than others, but it is a crucial element.
Well, and I'm going to take you back, if you don't mind, to your first Olympics. And this is a question I ask of everyone. And so far, I haven't got the same answer yet, which I think is pretty cool. When you realize you've made the games, especially when it wasn't your discipline growing up. So you're like, hey, I'm going to the Olympics and I'm going to the Winter Olympics. Okay, that's interesting. When does it hit you? Does it hit you when you make your debut for the event? Does it hit you when you enter the Olympic Village, or does it hit you during the opening ceremonies? When does it really hit you that I'm really in the Olympics?
It is a good question. I think, fortunately for the athletes, it can hit you at different times because first you're named to the team, and that's huge. But it's not over yet because you got to be healthy between now and the games. And so I can remember in 98, so we had 2 World Cup races left after the Olympic team was named. And being a dangerous sport, And we only had men's bobsled at the time. Didn't have women's bobsled, didn't have skeleton. And kind of one of the things that we would say to one another is, okay, we survived these next 2 races. We're Olympians.
Okay, right.
And so that was important, right? To make sure that you get there healthy. And once that happened, so after that second race, that's when it hit us again, because, okay, we made it. And then it gets real in a hurry walking through the opening ceremonies. And I mean, that's a feeling it's difficult to describe. But walking through the opening ceremonies, and just the noise, and that's when the enormity, the gravity of the situation, that's where that hit me. And you just realize just how big the moment is. And I remember thinking, as I'm walking around the stadium with this constant noise and this adrenaline, and I remember thinking, man, I wish everybody could feel this just once, because this is the most amazing thing ever. And, a lot of things are going through your mind. Like, these people are going crazy because I got USA on the uniform, and I'm representing my country, and my country's counting on me. And, and you don't always think of that on the lead up, that, all right, I got a responsibility now.
It's bigger than I am. Yeah.
Yeah. My nation's believing in me, and so just that there's so many thoughts, going through your mind, but it's all so amazing, and such a great feeling. And so that's certainly when it hits you. But, and then when you compete, I love telling the story, because I always prided myself on, my ability to get amped up for a race. And I was an adrenaline junkie, and I couldn't get fired up enough. And so, and I had a routine down, and I wasn't going to change anything for the games. So I know what time I'm going to start and what I'm going to do. And so I start doing this, and it's for the 4-man race in Nagano. And something was a little different. My body felt great. I wasn't tired anywhere, sore, nothing like that. The body's just ready to go. But mentally, I was amped up like now, right? And so the normal progression wasn't happening because it was so fast. And I'd never been in a mental state that it felt like, all right, that's enough. That's enough adrenaline.
Throw it out a little bit.
Yeah, let's calm it down. But this was the first one, because I had never been that amped up. And I had, there was still 20 minutes, 30 minutes left before the race. You can't sustain that. And so it was the first time I actually had to calm myself down as I was going through a warm-up. And so that certainly was different. And then walking out to the line, I also was really good at being very positive and focusing on the right things. And I had thoughts going through my head that I'm not proud of today. It's kind of embarrassing to admit to, and it was only before the first heat, but walking out to the line for that first start, I'm walking out there and I'm trying to be calm, and I remember thinking, all right, you've done this hundreds of times. It's no different. And then a voice out of nowhere came in and said, yeah, but this is the only one that counts. This is the only one the world's going to see. This is the only one that you're going to be judged on, no matter how it goes. And, I'm like having an inner struggle to, shut up. That doesn't matter. Right. And
who invited you? Right.
Right. And I never had to deal with that. I never had doubts in my head, for the beginning of a race. But I remember back to, my decathlon days and And I was in a situation that it kind of reminded me, and this is happening very quick, but I thought about this. So this is at the national championships, NCAA championships in 1991. And I got a solid score going. I was going to be an All-American as long as I, didn't blow up in anything. And I'm in the discus, and I had 2 fouls, and I got 1 throw left. And if I foul, it's over. And I know that if I make eye contact with my coach in the stands, he's going to tell me to take a standing throw because it's the safest way to go.
Right.
And I didn't know if I wanted to do that. And I didn't want to lose that kind of control of the situation. So I never looked up. And I don't know what made me think of this, but I basically came to the conclusion that, all right, look, I'm just going to relax and throw. And if I foul, I foul. So I kind of gave myself permission to fail, or to not be perfect. And I got to be okay with that. Right. And so that's what I did, and ended up having a personal best at the time. And it was a nice, easy throw, but I had plenty of adrenaline. So I kind of did the same thing. And I, gave myself permission to not be perfect in the situation. And that calmed me down. The thoughts disappeared. And, ended up, we had a great first push. It went just as expected. And it was the only time I ever had those thoughts in a competition. And the next 3 heats were, it was just like a normal race, just a little louder. But it was, I was glad I got through that and in the right way, because otherwise would have been a cautionary tale that I didn't like sharing.
Well, it's something you mentioned, and I think they tie together when you're talking about, especially in youth athletics, who's putting the pressure on you and why, and if it's coming from parents or outside external sources, you can't control that. So, what I would do as a coach, I would, mention to some of, especially the younger kids, like, you're not a finished product yet. Now, on the Olympic stage, that might be a different story, but, you're not a finished product. So it really doesn't matter right now, as long as you try and do your best and you go out and do it. But if you're worried about how you're going to perform now, when you don't really know what you're doing, what are you going to do 5 years from now when you do have the knowledge? And are you afraid to are you going to be able to gain that knowledge? So I think that you said as a cautionary tale, I think that's very important that we look at that and say, if you want to perform your best, you have to perform your best. You can't be worried about all the other things that are going to maybe could happen, not happen, who knows? And that, I think that gets, and you read stories about, Steve Sachs or Rick Ankiel or these people that develop the yips. And part of it is, I'm trying to be perfect. And, you're going to get that one perfect run, but even that's not perfect.
Right.
I spoke to Gordy Shear, who was in the 98 games as well. Sure. And he said, we got the silver and we were just a little off the gold. But I went back and looked at the film and I'm satisfied because we did everything we were supposed to do. And we didn't have that extra 500th of a second. We didn't have it. They just were that much better than us. So you go accept your medal and walk off.
Yeah, and that is so important because I've seen this with drivers in bobsled, and most drivers start out as a push athlete that's transitioning, and so they usually have a fantastic start, and it's their driving ability. They lose time down the hill as early in their career, right? And so, but then later in their career, when they are much better pilots, they have lost a step, and so they've lost a little bit at the start. And it's not uncommon to see the pilots get worse when this happens, worse at driving, because they know they've lost that cushion, and they didn't appreciate it at the time, but knowing that you're going to have a better start than most athletes, most teams at the beginning, that gives you some room to make mistakes.
Right.
And by having that room, you know what, you can take risks a little bit more. You can afford to make some mistakes, and you tend to be a little looser, and you know, and a better driver. But when you know that you lose that, and you lose that cushion, and you can't afford to make the same mistakes anymore, and you have to drive perfect, as soon as you decide that, it's almost a guarantee you're not going to drive perfect. So you're going to make more mistakes. You're going to hang on too tight. You're going to think about every mistake that you made as you're going down the hill, which is going to affect the next. And so, you know, you're right. You might have a perfect run every so often. It's rare, but it's not because you were thinking about being perfect. You know, it's because you were probably taking chances. You were probably thinking about, you know, being fast, and you were probably in the moment and one with the sled and a state of flow and all that. But perfection can be your enemy for sure, as an athlete. And see it all the time. And you know, with kids especially, really important to define success. And you should do it as an individual if you can. When you're younger, you got to help a young person to define success, and it should be based on where they are, not where somebody else is or where they're supposed to be. Like, look, this is where you are, and if you keep making progress, eventually you're going to get really far, and maybe to the ultimate. But you got to start here. You know, you can't. If you're playing football, and the ball's on the 50-yard line, you can't go down to the end zone because that's where you want to wind up. You know, you got to move the ball where the ball is. You know, that's just how it works. And so it's easy to get confused and forget about that. But you gotta meet the athlete where they are and help them to make improvements from there.
Well, I have a perfect story for that. I'm to call myself an average golfer or mediocre golfer is an insult to mediocre golfers, but okay. But, and I mean, I'm not good, but I was playing a course that we played constantly. And at the end of the second hole, I was 3 under par. I've never been under par in my life, but I was 3 under. And I just hit a few great shots. And then I pulled out the scorecard and I wrote it down. I can break par. Oops. If I hadn't wrote the score down, who knows? I may have actually been able to do something. But once I thought I'm going to be able to do this, and I think I finished 27 over at that point, it's like I realized that I'm actually doing well at this. And then there's the pressure of now I have to get the score. I have to do this. I've got to shape this shot. I've got to do that stuff that I don't even know how to do. That I'm thinking, well, if I just put this and it spins that way, there's another birdie.
Right.
Yeah. And we get that. And like I said, we put the pressure on ourselves, and especially in a sport that comes up every 4 years. I can imagine that's part of why when you were there, you went, it just all hits you at one time. So,
right.
Now, when we look at how we're looking at it from an international perspective now for what you're doing now. What can you do, or what can your organization do to get more of, as we were talking about earlier, to get the Olympic movement, or in particular the bobsled movement, more to the front of how we see things? Is that a logical thing to think of right now, or just to grow the sport? There's a question in there someplace if you search for it.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. It's a challenge. It's a challenge for a few reasons. One is there's just not a lot of tracks around, and it doesn't make sense for there to be a lot of tracks around because they're very expensive to maintain. And you really need large events to justify them. And we see tracks that close down if they don't get used. And so, it's probably not going to make sense to have tons of tracks around because there's not a club, club level participation that's going to justify it. And so knowing that, you're immediately limiting the number of participants. It's look, if you got a baseball diamond that you can play on, or a soccer field, you can put those up all over the place and increase the numbers, but it's not the same,
Right.
with sliding sports. And so you do have some limitations on the numbers within the nations and globally as well. And so, knowing that, you've got a real challenge, because that means you're not going to have the same kind of pipeline that a lot of sports have, and you're not going to be able to grow the numbers in the same way that you can in other sports. And there's always a risk that the IOC looks at the cost of building a sled for a new Olympic host, and the sustainability of those tracks, if you look historically at tracks around the world. And so there is a risk that at some point they say, look, it doesn't make sense to continue the sliding sports. And so we're going to, add another ski event or something like that. And it could be the end. And so that's certainly a risk and a fear internationally. And so, it's important that we keep the numbers up. But we're also realistic with how much we're able to grow that.
Right. Right.
And, if you look at like the TV audience, we're very much aware of where those come from, where the eyeballs are coming from. And in the US and North America, we've always seen that as kind of the sleeping giant in terms of viewers. And, it's at best we can say we're underperforming in terms of the audience. And so, but we're also, it's very competitive in North America with other sports. And so, you're competing against some very popular sports for TV time, and it's not the easiest sell to make. If you're looking in Germany, that's where the majority of the viewers come from.
Right.
It's got a huge tradition in sliding, luge, skeleton, but they don't have, American football. That's both stealing athletes from bobsled, as well as eyeballs, and it's a winter sport, so you're not competing against soccer. So it is a little bit different, but we have seen opportunity in China, as they develop their sliding sports in preparation for the Beijing Olympics. We've seen the popularity of the sport growing over there in terms of audience size, and so hopefully that continues. And the real challenge there is, will they continue that after the games in 2022? We saw the same thing in Korea, and they did an incredible job, the Koreans, of developing their teams and being competitive for the medals. And so, and with that, you're going to get eyeballs, right? You're going to get, fans and excitement from the nation anytime that you are in the hunt for medals. And so they did it right, and hopefully we see the same from China, and that would certainly help. But then you've got the immediate challenge of, okay, let's say Korea continues their investment, and let's say China does as well. Japan does have a track in Nagano, and it doesn't get utilized the way that we would like it to. But from an international perspective, when we're setting the calendar, if you've got growth in Asia, you better have opportunities for those tracks, for World Cups, World Championships. And as soon as you introduce that, you're having a huge impact on the calendar for teams to travel and the costs involved. And the hosts of these races are always competing because they want to hold World Cup races. And so, it doesn't make sense just to go to one stop in Asia. But if you can go to 3, it makes sense logistically and
Right.
financially. But what are you cutting out? You're probably going to lose races in North America, to justify the Asian part of the tour. So there's a lot of dominoes that fall as you expand the sport, and that's one of them with Asia. It's an opportunity, but what's that impact going to be on
what cost? Right. Yeah.
On North America? So,
well, the thing that I noticed is that you grow because of the passion.
mm-hmm.
And the people that are passionate, this is what we were talking about when we start as kids. We have fun, we stay involved. You grow because of the passion, and the people with passion help grow the sport. So once you get people like yourself in that can't think of anything else to do because that's what they want to do, they want to be involved with it, then I think that'll help things. And it doesn't have to become huge. It just has to be, as you said, sustainable. So I think because the people I've been speaking to, that you're in good shape. Could it be better? Of course, everything can be. But I think that with an Olympic year coming up where I don't know that it's good or bad that you're going to have, summer, winter, how that's going to work out. But I think we'll at least be in the forefront of people's minds.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that passion thing is, you're right on the money. And we joke internally that, you see, it's like once you get involved with the sport, we joke that it's a sickness that you can't get rid of.
It is, right? Yeah.
And it's, you're just passionate about it. And, one of the ways that we joke about it, because we are, it's a lot of type A personalities, and there's a lot of, joking and we give each other a lot of, hard time, but all in fun. But we do joke that, the reason that people stay involved in the sport so long is because after you do it for a while, you're not fit to do anything else. You can't be released in the public. You got to stick around, just with the sport where they understand, that you're broken and, you're not but it's, it does seem to be consistent that, once you're involved, you go from athlete to coach to official or volunteer. And it's nothing to see, Olympic medalists and gold medalists just walking around, enjoying the race and just part of the atmosphere at any World Cup race. And they're not there for an appearance. They're there, because they want to be, and they're probably,
right.
Working in some capacity, not expecting to sign autographs, just loving the sport.
Just being there, yeah. Well, yeah. Darrin, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you being on with us. It's been great talking to you. A little knowledge that what I always love about this is, as I said earlier, I learned something that I didn't know that I wanted to learn, that I wanted to learn, that I learned. It's a fantastic thing that, things that I hadn't thought of and things that I had thought of have been explained to me and hopefully to the audience again. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yep. You got it, Frank. Thanks for having me.
I will keep in touch. Thanks.
All right.